forestry, the idea behind food forestry is that a forest in itself doesn't need watering, it doesn't need fertilizing, it doesn't need pesticides, it doesn't need fungicides. That self-maintains itself, and it grows abundantly in doing so. If food forestry, we adopt these natural systems that occur in nature and apply it to growing food and productive plants that actually benefit us. So we don't have to water, so we don't have to apply fungicides, so we don't have to apply pesticides, and so we don't have to irrigate.
Yay!
Yeah, that sounds like, oh, okay, like that's a pretty wild experience, but there really is just a different way of working with nature. In forestry, we try to work with nature and these natural systems and evolve them and try to improve them. The traditional method, unknowingly to us, would make plants very dependent on us, and we go against a lot of these natural systems, and it's just by circumstance, but we'll discuss why. Okay, so the reason why we couldn't do a lot of these methods in the past because we're just beginning to understand a lot of the hidden pieces of the puzzle that give us the understanding how forests take care of themselves, how they water themselves, how they fertilize themselves, how they feed themselves. We're just beginning to understand this. We're just beginning to get understand the science. We have the microscopes that can see these tiny little creatures that are microscopic that exist in the soil, and they're called soil microbiology. And these organisms, you can't see them with the human eye, but they exist and they have a lot of purposes within nature, and they have a lot of beneficial purposes in growing food and productive plants. And I'll explain with you now. So we're just beginning to understand and comprehend these organisms and why we need to work with them and their role. And so firstly, these tiny soil microbiology, these tiny organisms, this bacteria, this fungi, that we only see the bad sides of them when they actually take out our crops. But there's good guys within them that have a lot of beneficial and symbiotic relationships with plants. And I'll put it to you simply like this, is plants don't feed themselves. It's actually, within nature, it's the soil microbiology, that tiny little organisms that feed the plant. So what happens is the plant realizes it needs a particular nutrient for growth or to regrow something to repair or to produce a fruit. And it communicates with these tiny microscopic organisms on its roots and says, I need this particular type of nutrient. Who can get me that? And Billy the bacteria puts up his hand and goes, yep, I can mine you that. So that bacteria goes and mines nitrogen or calcium or silica, comes back to the plant and says, I've got the nutrients for you. And a plant gives it sugars from its root system, and they make an exchange. It's a symbiotic exchange that occurs naturally in nature. And that's how plants feed themselves. They don't feed themselves, the soil, life actually feeds them. When a lot of cultures, they used to talk about the spirit of the land, that the soil is alive, it very much is so. We could not comprehend that till now, but it's very alive with these tiny microscopic organisms. And so they feed plants. A plant knows how much it needs and when. It knows when it needs to grow and how much it needs to do so. But with traditional agriculture, and we think we know better. It's not. It's just the style that we do it now, and that causes a lot of problems. When we put down water-soluble fertilizers, we actually force-feed plants nutrients, and we didn't know this initially, but we do that. When we put down water-soluble nutrients, like salt-based fertilizers, the plant, when it goes to absorb water, goes, oh Jesus, where did all this nitrogen come from? I didn't ask for this. And we've just spiked the water with the nutrients, and it's taking it up. And the plant goes, okay, I have to do something for these nutrients, or I'll actually overdose the nutrients. It's called nitrification. So it has to put these nutrients to something. So it puts this flush of growth, these new leaves and these new stems and new fruit, into the detriment of its long-term growth. And we look at it and we go, oh Jesus, we did a good job. Look at our plants thrive. It's exploded since I put all those chemical fertilizers on. But in doing so, we've done a few things. We've now made the plant dependent on us. So naturally, in nature, it would have had that relationship with those tiny organisms. But because we've fed the plant, and the plant's got so much nitrogen, Billy the bacteria goes to the plant, hey, I got some nitrogen for you, and the plant's like, man, I've got so much nitrogen right now, I can't help you out, you know, like, come back later when I need it. And Billy the bacteria's like, what am I gonna do? You know, like, where am I gonna eat? You're my source of food. So it either dies or that bacteria goes somewhere else. And now this plant is no longer has the capacity to naturally feed itself because we've eliminated, cut it from its legs, its source to naturally eat that food. And not only that, there's good organisms that I was telling you about. They exist around the root and have those good relationship with the plants. And then the bad bacteria comes into town and goes, oh, I want that plant. The good guys go, no mate, me and this plant have a good thing going to it. You know, like we have a good relationship. Leave it alone. Feed the plant are actually the plant's immune system. It protects the plant. They're its own private army. They have mutual exchange and they push the bad parasitic organisms, the bad bacteria, the bad fungi, and keep it away from the plant. And in doing so, the plant feeds the bacteria that, you know, fight off the bad guys' sugars, and then they have a mutual exchange. So when we feed plants with water-soluble fertilizers, we're doing this with a good intent, but we're making the plant dependent on us to accumulate nutrients. We're actually force-feeding it nutrients, and not at the time, the stage that it would want it. So it might have a rapid growth, but it won't have. Think of it as, the stage in teenagehood that young men, they grow and they've got really long legs and arms, but they have no muscle structure because they're like their bones have grown faster than their muscles have, so they're lanky. And you notice this with plants and trees that you fertilize too. They're really tall and they look really strong, really big, but they don't have muscle, they don't have the lignin, they don't have the support. And they also have a lot of problems too. You get a lot of pest damage too, because when a plant has to create that extra growth, it makes this flurry of new leaves, but then the leaves cross over it themselves because they have to make room, and then that's a home for a pest, a bad insect, and it's not what the plant would naturally do, and a plant would never cross over its leaves like that if it was growing naturally. It's a waste of energy, it won't get any sunlight, but that's just the position it's been put in, and it's just making it do what it can. So this green growth that we see in freshly fertilized plants is actually the plant growing unnaturally. And if you grow your food and your fruit trees or any plant in this method, that you put the biology, the life of the soil, and you help that grow, then the plant will have the widest spectrum of nutrients and have the most dense nutrients possible. It will have less disease, and because a healthy plant isn't susceptible to pest and disease unless there's large numbers. And also it tastes really good. You notice that you might have slightly smaller, cucumbers that might be this big until like this big, but it has high nutrient density. There's been studies that take these giant, cucumbers that are grown from commercial farms and compare them to bio-intensive farms that might grow slightly smaller cucumbers. It's not the size, it's what you do with it. And they have a higher nutrient density than the larger cucumber. And I found in my garden, after I'm eating the food that I've grown in this way, I don't need to eat so much because I'm getting the nutrients I need from a small amount of plants. So it's not the size, it's the value of it. And once people start appreciating that, then they will pay a higher price for a smaller product because they know, okay, like I could buy this giant zucchini, or I could buy a smaller zucchini and I'd be fed just as much and it'll be better for me. And that's the long and short of it. So that's how plants naturally feed themselves and how they protect themselves. When they do it this way, they have all these complex sugars and these complex nutrients in their leaves, which makes it really hard for insects to eat them. When they eat them, it's like eating a really rich chocolate cake. You try that, and you eat a few bites of it, but it's so rich and it's so strong and it's so dense that you just can't eat anymore. That's the plant equivalent insect equivalent of that. So your insects might do damage to your plants, but they can't do too much damage. You know? But in the plant, when it's healthy, it's giving off all these pheromones that attract predators to eat the pest. So the pest knows, oh, I can only eat this much, but I need to get going before this plant attracts the guys that eat me. So they can't stick around to do enough damage. When your plants are fed with water-soluble fertilizers, they can't produce those complex sugars in the leaves, and it's like potato chips. The insects can just eat, the whole plant. And there's nothing stopping it, and they can take it out. And the plant's not healthy enough to make these pheromones, so it can't even call the good guys to protect them.
So can you wean the plant off the water-soluble?
Yeah, you can do that, but you need to once. What we've done too, when you put down salt-based fertilizers, not many living organisms can do the salt. So it kills the good guys that would have naturally fed the plant too. So what you need to do, you need to bring them back. And so you need to make some compost, or make some compost tea. You can buy this from your local shop, from Enviromart in cans. You need to put that down into your garden. So you need to give the plant the opportunity to feed itself. If you just go, okay, I'm not going to feed you water-soluble fertilizers anymore, the plant will die because it's now dependent on you. Because what it used to be independent is now gone. So you need to bring that back. But there's nothing stopping you from feeding it. So yeah, healthy plant, that's how a healthy plant, fed from microbiology, isn't susceptible to pest and disease. So we just need to help plants naturally feed themselves. And that's good doing it that way. It saves you a lot of time and a lot of money doing it this way. Plants have the capacity to feed themselves. If I was wrong, the whole forest would die. That's long and short of it. And when you do it this way, plants don't become dependent on you. You get nutrient-dense food. So that's why you let plants grow themselves. Okay?
So can you talk a little bit about the layers of the forest?
Oh, yep. Yep. So we'll go into the next step, which is plants themselves. When you're doing this method of feeding, plants naturally, you have to. When it comes down to it, if you think about it this way, if you have two of the same plant right next to each other, and their roots are interlocked, and they both need the same nutrient from the same good guys that feed them, they're not going to compete for those nutrients. So they're both going to lose out in the end. And this is why in nature, we look at a forest and we're just like, all these plants are different, it's chaotic, it's really, it's actually a really just complex design. It's a really smart design. Nature knows that if it has lots of plants next to each other, they won't have as much nutrients and they won't be as strong, and the pests will come in later. They're a bit diverse. So when you're planting your plants, think about this. Your neighbours might come and look at your garden and be like, oh God, this garden's so chaotic. But you have method to your madness. You know why you're doing it. If you place your plants in different places, they don't have to compete for nutrients. They'll be stronger. They'll be able to pollinate each other. It's just a better way of doing it. And because you're doing it in this method too, you can grow plants closer together because they're not competing for the nutrients. And plants need different nutrients. You can actually grow plants much closer together than you would the other way. And you can also stack them amongst themselves. So if we do examples here. In a forest, we've seen how there's multiple levels of different trees, and they're all growing. They're not, they're competing for sunlight, but they all kind of work together. And that's what we've realised, that a forest actually works together and doesn't compete with each other, because it doesn't have to. There's abundance of nutrients, and if they all work together, they all evolve together. But you can apply this to your veggie garden, but also to your food forest. Is that you can grow more in a smaller space of area, because you can stack them. You can stack your plants on multiple levels. This has a number of purposes. That you get more for your bang for your buck. You get more nutrients. In a food forest, we have up in this region, probably you can have 6 to 7. Down in the tropics, you probably have up to 12. You can have 12 layers of food. So you can have a ground cover, that produces tiny berries. Underneath that, you could have a root crop that produces, root vegetables. Above that, you could have a tiny little shrub or a large herb. Above that, you could have a small tree. Above that, you could have a medium-sized tree, and then you could have 2 more layers on top of that. So now you've got 8 layers of food production.
And a vine growing up it.
And a vine growing up it. There's multiple more potentials that you can do in this method. And so you get 8 layers of food, 8 layers of potential product, 8 layers of nutrients. And because trees are kind of an all year round thing, and they're kind of self-maintaining, and they last for hundreds of years, some fruit trees. So if you grow food in this way, you're creating a legacy for your kids too. You're not just creating one crop that'll be over at the end of the season. You're creating a crop that might last for hundreds of years and continue to create more and more abundance in doing so. So it's a more efficient way of farming. We can't use machinery in this method, but what we can't do, what machinery does, we do in just practicality. And the overheads that cost for the machinery and the chemicals and the fertilizers and the fungicides, you don't have to pay that in food forests. So financially, short term, you make a little bit less money, but long term it continues to grow itself, has little to no input whatsoever other than labor, and will continue to supply produce which you can feed to your family and you can sell externally, and that can meet your needs in food but also financially too. So it's a very financially viable option long term. And so yeah, you can stack your plants. This is what we do in food forests. We have multiple layers of food, not just food. You can have plants, that you can use for building material like bamboos. You can put plants, that you can use for dyes or fabric or weaving. You put plants, that you can use for tool making or oil production. Or you put plants that are medicinal, that have some medicinal purpose. The sky's the limit when it comes to your food forest. The more diversity you have, the better actually. The more diversity you have in your food forest, those organisms that I was telling you about before, each organism has, each plant produces its own flavor of sugar, which attracts its own unique microorganism. There's billions of different of these types of these guys, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what they do and how they do it. But we know enough now to know that's very, very important, what we've been underestimating over the years. But so the more diversity of plants that you have, the more flavors of sugars you have, the more different type of organisms will come, and the more nutrients that will be available to your plants as well. Because each one of those different organisms have a different role. They mine, or they protect, or they do something. So the more different diversity you have, the more chaotic it looks, like a forest, the better it'll grow and the more self-maintaining. So you can't just put in a forest in the ground straight at once. You need to build this over time. But long term it has a lot of benefits. Okay, before I go into the process of building a food forest, I'll just talk about which is the most contentious one out of the three, and talk about plants can feed themselves. Watering, okay? People say, oh no, plants can't water themselves. Literally they can't. If you're building a food forest, just like anything, plants more like any organism, any human, any animal, at its juvenile stage is when it needs the most support. You can't just put a baby plant in the ground. We've probably done this with seedlings. Go nuts. It needs a bit of watering. It needs to put down its roots. It needs to establish itself. So it needs a bit of support when establishing a food forest. The forest naturally water themselves is through three processes. First, they put their roots down deep into the earth. And there's this underground water that flows through the soil. It's like an underground river. And it flows through the soil and goes to rivers, and they charge up the river. Ever noticed how a river's flowing weeks after a rain event?
Yeah.
And you're always just it hasn't rained in months. Where's this water coming from? It's coming from that slow flow that's coming through the land. The trees actually stop it. They actually net that water, so slow down that water flow going through the landscape. And they suck up that water, and they feed off that. Another thing that they do is that plants, they shed their leaves and they create this layer of compost. Have you ever been in the forest and pick up the soil and it's wet and spongy?
Yeah.
That's called that's humus or mulch too. And that's just nature's sponge for once. It keeps the soil, the moisture in the top layer, soaks it up like a sponge. But it also insulates it and stops it from drying out. So we've always had you put a wet towel indoors, and it's wet for a few days. But if you put it a wet sheet in the sun, in the wind, then it dries out really fast. That's the process of transpiration.
And you said something that wind is the biggest issue with water.
That's it. So like if you have a canopy, if you have your soil shaded, it has a layer of mulch, and it has what we call a wind buffer that stops the wind from going through. Because when you put wet shirt in front of a fan, then it dries off sooner. So if you have air flowing through your food forest, then it'll dry out faster. So a windbreak, and you notice when you're in the center of a forest, a few kilometers in, you don't feel any wind. Nature's actually did that for a reason, because the wind actually blows away a lot of the moisture. And the way that plants keep a nice moist environment weeks after rain is because they create that environment that stops the moisture from being released. They also release moisture themselves. When plants, they suck up that water from deep in the ground, and they pump it out of their leaves in a process called transpiration. And they do this to create that really moist environment around it. It stops it from drying out, and they don't need as much watering. So that's the three ways that plants maintain and draw up water. The last one being is the soil microbiology, those good guys I was telling you about. There's a long list of things that they do, but another thing that they do is they create the mushroom or fungi. They create these tiny micro wells that trap water. They also draw water out of soil particles. They also make that spongy soil that keeps that moisture. So they're really important. The more that you more of them that you put into your soil, the more benefits that you get as well. So that's how to keep, and it really does. You can apply this to garden. I had a bet with a mate. See, his garden can last longest without water. Mine was 4.5 months in and it was looking fine. It really is this way. I got water from the rain. I did some sneaky things like put some fennel so when the mist came in it would trap the little droplets. But other than that, that was all that I did. And that's why I support. A lot of people think that growing their own food is a huge hassle. It requires all this time, wasted, watering, fertilizing, and all this stuff. If you grow food, if you grow plants the way that they want to be grown, you support the natural growth. They're not dependent on you, they can do it themselves. But at the same time, when we see our plant withered up a little bit, we get really scared and go, oh, I need to water my plant. Look, it's got these withering leaves. No, actually, that's just a plant. When they close up their leaves, that's to stop the sun from being down at them. And it's to stop them from pumping out that moisture. So it's them just closing off the door, and trapping in the moisture. And then when the sun passes and it gets a little bit less hot, then they open up their leaves again. And but if we see that problem, we're like, oh no, my plant's dying, we water it. The plant goes, oh, I guess it's not sunny. I didn't see that cloud, but I guess I got rained on, and it opens up its leaves. And then the next time it's sunny again, it closes them, but then you water it again and it opens up its leaves. After a while, I go, oh, I don't need to close my leaves at all.